So today's call is on a nice tool which the Catalyst have launched called DigiSafe, and we're going to be talking about digital safeguarding in a broader context. We've talked about this in a few calls before. We've had one specifically on safeguarding. We also had a closed call for people working in the violence against women and girls sector. So we've covered this before, but where this is a bit different is we're talking about a specific tool which is going to give you some step-by-step digital safeguarding advice, and how you apply some of those kind of principles, build some of those foundations, assess risk, design for safety, and how you can educate your staff and your volunteers and your trustees and also your beneficiaries as well. I do have the shoutiest child in the world who is shouting at one of our friends in the background, so if you can hear that, that's what's going on at the moment. So we're going to hear first of all from Charné and Joe Robertson. Joe Robertson, I said I wouldn't do it, Joe, and I've just like given you the wrong surname. I'm sorry. I look at your surname on there and I'm like, it must be a typo. I'll just call him Robertson. That'll be it. That's fine. But it's not a typo. That's just your name. So we're going to hear from them first to talk about the tool. I've also put a link to the tool in the chat as well. And then we're going to hear from Joe Sharpen and Cordy Ruck, who are going to be talking about some of the key principles. So they work for AVA, so Against Violence and Abuse. So Joe and Charne, do you want to do it separately or do you want to do it together? What would be best for you?
I'd suggest we do it together. What do you reckon, Charne?
Go for it. I like it. Good. Yeah.
Yeah. That way, anything that either of us forgets about, we've got it covered.
Yeah. So before you start, I want you to give context to the background of what I'm seeing in your video.
Me?
You look like you're in like the most picturesque little caravan or something. Or cabin in the woods. So.
Oh, I am. I'm in I'm a van dweller. I live and work in a van, and I've been in the same place since lockdown started. I don't know what you can see outside. The view out the other side is even better. Yeah, it's lovely. I got loads of solar power. I got 24 megabytes of Wi-Fi, so it's pretty good actually.
Cool. Right, I'm very jealous.
Didn't expect that question.
Right, continue. We can talk about the van afterwards.
Yeah, sure. Let's do it. All right. Plug my mouse back in. Yeah. So a little bit of context about DigiSafe then. Maybe actually I'll cue Charne first, just to talk about how this came about, because she was involved earlier than me. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds good. So hi everyone, I'm Charné. I work for CAST as a service designer. So we work with loads of different charities across the UK to support them with service design. And I lead on our Tech for Good and Tech vs Abuse programs as the program coordinator. And really through the process of working with so many charities across the past year or so through these programs, we've seen a real need when charities come to the stage where they're kind of ready to launch a tool or a service digitally to their service users, where suddenly there's like a bit of a mad rush and a realization that, ooh, there's all of these other aspects and all these things that could potentially go wrong that we haven't really thought about or haven't really planned for. And we started seeing these conversations and these fears and some of these risks coming up more and more through our different peer learning sessions that we have in the program, and people just looking for guidance and advice and examples of how to do this well, and also just kind of the steps to take. Like, it can be really overwhelming thinking about all of the risks involved when you're designing a digital service, and how do you kind of break those down into manageable chunks that you can start to think about more practically. We found that many of the charities we were working with often had a safeguarding policy in place, but a lot of this was just kind of something that was theoretical and quite in-depth about kind of how they were managing risks across the organization, but it didn't really translate very well into the practical sense of how they would apply these principles into a digital context. And I think with the outbreak of COVID, we just saw a real spike in the number of charities that were having to quickly digitize their services. And so that need to kind of have some practical guidance to begin to put some risk management processes in place, and also to begin to think about how we design services in a way that actually protects not only us as an organization, but also the people who are interacting with the different services, started really coming to the fore. And we started hearing a need for something tangible that people could use and learn from a lot more. And that's kind of where this all started from, and where we started engaging with Ava. And we've been working with Joe for quite a while as well. Joe's been quite involved in previous kind of Tech for Good programs as well. So his expertise on just digital safeguarding and risk management was so valuable. And then Joe, Sharpen and Cordy from Ava have been brilliant in developing online digital safeguarding sessions. So we initially ran some online safeguarding workshops with charities, which were initially just for the program grantees that we were working with. But we started getting more and more requests from other charities. And so we broadened that out and we opened it out. And then we started seeing some of these kind of key themes coming up over and over again. And that's kind of how we all got together and decided to do something about it. And thanks to the brilliant support of the Cloth Workers Foundation, we could form a bit of a task team to actually start to put the wheels in motion. I'm going to bounce back to Joe.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so Charné talked a little bit about helping charities through the process of safeguarding, and then she also talked about when designing digital services. And really, DigiSafe is all about taking a design-led approach to digital safeguarding, so that charities can actually find it maybe a bit easier to get to think about safeguarding at the start of creating a service rather than just before it goes live, and help them go through a process as they are developing and designing their service, so that they have support to think about safeguarding at every step. It's definitely a process rather than an event, but it is about supporting a sort of intentional design-led approach to designing the safest possible services. But it's also about how to help them get ready to deliver them safely, and how to recognise and respond to safeguarding issues when they're actually delivering those services as well. So it all kind of mixes up a little bit. There's lots of sort of areas where it all sort of blends together, but in the end it's about recognising that there's a process you can go through right from when you start thinking about a service, and that you're going to be on a journey as you design your service, and at different points you're going to need to think about safeguarding in different ways. And we also know that there are hundreds of charities that are still taking their service online, that need this input, and that there are lots who have done quite quickly, and this is designed so to help them actually go back and do maybe a more thorough risk assessment of what they are offering online. So before DigiSafe, the best things out there was the guide that Ava wrote back in May, and a bit of a risk assessment guide that we developed at Catalyst as well. But there wasn't really one place where you could go and expect to get started wherever you are at on your journey. So it is very much designed for hopping in where you are, whichever kind of charity you are. But I think the other thing is, of course, we know as you're designing a service, it's not like you just kind of go from A to B. There's lots of stopping off points, and sometimes you need to cycle back. And as your ideas develop around how your service is going to work, it might raise new issues. So DigiSafe is sort of designed to encourage you to go back and just look at your risk assessment as your idea of how you're going to deliver your service gets clearer. And that's another reason why I sort of describe it as a process rather than an event, because we think you should be cycling back probably and revisiting your risk assessment, and then it actually becomes a live sort of dashboard that helps you through that process. There's a couple of other things I'd like to sort of add to that is on what that journey looks like. We've designed it with the idea that if you're at the beginning stage of your digital safeguarding journey, you probably need to create some kind of policy, and that your foundations are all about either integrating digital safeguarding into existing safeguarding policy, or maybe in some cases creating a separate policy for it. But that once that foundation is in place, you can then start thinking about risk assessment, which will be a dynamic process that happens throughout, the process of reviewing your service or designing a new one. And that maybe once you've got that started, you need to also think about universal principles that apply to any kind of digital service delivery. And that actually, depending on how your service ends up looking, whether you may be delivering it over Zoom or by SMS or text message, or maybe using chatbots, that there are specific risks that come with each of those maybe platforms, and that it's useful to have guidance for particular ways of delivering your services. And then there's also a need, obviously, to educate your staff, because when you then implement that service, your staff need to understand not just that how this service works in a safe kind of a way, but maybe what if I'm a staff member and I'm not able to work face to face with people, I'm not able to go and meet them. How do I then recognize safeguarding issues, maybe when I'm on a Zoom call with someone, or when I'm having a text interaction with someone? It may be the safeguarding issue may not be digital, but it may be present in that user's life, but noticing it might be you require different sort of vigilance or pattern recognition, because you're delivering services online rather than face to face when you're with that person, or maybe in their home. So it's designed at the implementation stage to help you think about how do you help your staff understand digital safeguarding, but also how to recognize abuse or safeguarding issues when they're delivering services. Yeah, and just to sort of let you know as well that what you see at the moment on DigiSafe is in what we call alpha. So we're testing it out, and subject to funding, we expect to iterate it further, because like Ross says, this is the first time that anyone's produced anything that tries to be this sort of broad and all-encompassing for the sector. So we expect that it can get smarter and savvier as we learn a bit more about how people are using it.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I like is, although I think it covers all the areas that need to be thought about, it's not overwhelming. So I think that's worth remembering, is for those of you in the room where you're a small charity or you're one of the larger organisations, it's not an overwhelming process, and it's really nicely structured. And there's also some templates in there. I think maybe the second step, the kind of policies that Joe spoke about, there's 2 templates, can't remember the organisations. So if you're thinking about what does this look like for our organisation, they're a good starting point rather than sitting down with a blank slate and trying to figure this stuff out. So we're going to hear now from Joe Sharpen and Cordy Ruck at AVA, and they're going to talk a wee bit about the kind of key principles and the kind of 6 steps that are in the DigiSafe guide. So I'll hand over to them just now.
Hello. Joe, do you want to start? Do you want to talk about our role at AVA?
Okay, yeah, I'll talk about that, and then you can cover the principles. So at AVA, we're a national charity working to end all forms of gender-based violence. And we've been doing work around digital work for many years, actually. And I personally have been providing clinical supervision and online counselling for several years. But obviously, as Charné was saying, when COVID hit, there were so many charities that were suddenly having to quite quickly move support services online, and were understandably concerned about how to do that safely. We were currently also working with Comic Relief and CAST to develop some digital tools ourselves for survivors, adults and children, survivors of domestic abuse. So we were going through that kind of mentoring process with CAST to develop our own resources. And then we're lucky enough to work with them to help the rest of the charity sector think more about safeguarding issues. So although we originally came from a violence against women and girls framework, there were so many charities from all across various sectors, both nationally and internationally, that were coming to our services, and it was to the webinars. And it was fascinating to hear about the different creative ways that people were deciding to move their work online. And so we worked originally on our resource guide, which I popped in the chat. So that was the original one that we developed. But then it was really good to work with Joe and CAST in more detail to develop the DigiSafe guide, which is kind of more streamlined. And like you say, has lots of practical templates and things. So together they kind of complement each other really well. So do you want to cover the principles, Cordy, and then I'll talk about the safety stuff?
Yeah, sure. So as Ross was saying, it's one of the great things about the guide is that it kind of has this very clear template and how to kind of go about safeguarding. So we created the 4th section of the resource, which is 5 key principles to think about when designing for safety. And that's thinking about safety, both in terms of your users, but also in terms of your staff. And it's also thinking about it in two different ways as well. It's thinking about safety in the way your service is delivered, but then also about the back office and how the safety of your service users is supported kind of in back office functions, data security, things like that. So the point of creating these principles was really to inform the risk assessment, whether you're creating a risk assessment itself or you're reviewing your own. So I'll run through the 5 key principles. I won't go into too much detail because hopefully you'll be reading the guide. But these are things that people already know, and anyone working in a support capacity will always be bearing them in mind. So the point of creating the principles was really to show people that they already know what they're doing. It's just about adapting those principles of consent and privacy and security into a digital space, and the differences that might incur in terms of the way you're interacting with your service users. So the first principle was designing for online behaviour. So that's thinking about the way people act differently online. We spoke in the resource about anonymity and how people might be disinhibited when they're online in terms of sharing more than they otherwise would. And it's about designing for those changes in the way people act online. The second principle is privacy. Again, just keeping your users informed at every stage, letting them know what their rights are. The third is consent, and it's also thinking about new ways to consider consent when you're getting people's consent online. So ensuring if you're creating an app, for example, that it's opt-in consent, or making a consent form engaging, so someone isn't just scrolling, clicking and passing through. People are, again, making them aware of their rights and their privacy rights. The third is information security. So that's all about kind of online information security and offline information security. And then we've got accessibility, which is all about both content and function. And then we kind of finish that section with a bit about guiding your staff and how to ensure that you teach your staff how to maintain these principles when you're designing digital services. So we noted down some key things to make your staff aware of, for example, how to secure their devices, how to teach their clients to secure their devices as well, how to collect consent, just basic core principles like that they should always follow when they're moving to remote working. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And so the next chapter is really building on those principles and thinking about how you use particular types of services online safely. So when we were doing the original webinars with CAST, I think we trained nearly up to 100 different charities who were all thinking about different ways of engaging with their service users, whether it be moving face-to-face group work online or one-to-one support, counselling, using chatbots, moderated forums, gaming, WhatsApp, all the different possible ways that you can think of that you could communicate online. So we then had to take each of those and think, okay, so what would the risks be for each of those different scenarios? So the main ones that we've covered are video-based services, message-based services, chatbots and live chats, online groups and forums. So for each of those, we've kind of come up with some key action points that you need to think about. So for instance, video-based servicing, if you're thinking about using Zoom or whatever platform, does it have the correct levels of security and privacy settings and also accessibility? Are your users going to be able to have a safe, confidential space to use that service and online? And how are you going to make sure that you know that they're safe and have a confidential space? And how are you going to mitigate the risks that we've come up with? So for each of these different platforms, we've thought about the potential risks, and for each of those risks, we've considered different questions you might need to ask yourself. So if the call quality is very poor or someone disconnects, how are you going to ensure that actually your users have got enough data or Wi-Fi to be able to make those calls? And also, if someone suddenly drops off the call, is it because their Wi-Fi's gone or because they're suddenly unsafe or they've been triggered by something that's been spoken about and they've had to leave? So for each of the platforms, we've really tried hard to think about the different risks that could arise so that you can preempt them. And then that goes back to the risk assessment that Joe was talking about. So there's a really good template on there, an Excel sheet that you can fill in to prioritise the different things you're going to have to think about in terms of risk assessment. And then under the risk section, there's more actions that you can take. So could you think about a safe word or a code in case your user needs to suddenly end the call, or if someone's walked into the room? Thinking about shared agreements for group calls. So just like in a face-to-face setting with a group work scenario, you would probably start with a group agreement. You would do that online as well, but you need to think about the additional stuff that you're going to have to be mindful of within that. And then, of course, for each of those, we've linked to some useful onward guidance or recommending other organisations that seem to be doing this really well. So we've got those for each of the different platforms that we identified that people were mostly using. And then the final section, section 6 of DigiSafe, is about education. So it's about how we can help our service users to stay safe using the different platforms, but also how staff can identify possible abuse when delivering services. So we're very mindful that, especially coming from a violence against women and girls perspective, technology is used to abuse and harm in many different ways, and it's a very common way. So we've listed the different things to be mindful of there, and just to think a little bit about if you're working with someone where you know that's been an issue, they might be more reticent to kind of use technology in a supportive way, or the devices they're using might be compromised with spyware and things like that. So it's about making sure that that is safe for them to use, and also that you can recognise abuse if it's occurring during the work that you're doing online with them. So there's lots of information there around how you would do that, how you might recognise if spyware has been used, and these are all things that you can pass on to your service users as well. There's lots of things around general safety advice online in terms of helping them to review their digital identity, thinking about different ways to turn off GPS tracking, and how to make sure your router is secure, and so on. But there's also a really important section which is about supporting staff themselves, and especially at the moment we've been hearing a lot about staff who've been quite traumatized by working remotely at home, especially those who are now having to bring trauma and difficult issues into their home environment, and how that they can and how to help them kind of ground themselves and deal with managing that, whereas normally they might be in an office and they could have a quick chat with a colleague or debrief really easily. I spoke to one worker and she said, I just have to work from my bedroom. So when I'm working, I sit on the right-hand side of the bed, and when I'm not, I switch to the left-hand side of the bed. That's obviously not the best way to be kind of maintaining a work-life balance, but in some cases it's all you can do. So how can we actually make that safe? And then also, how can we make it safe for service users? So one of the questions we had on one of the initial webinars was from a counselling provider who wanted to provide counselling support for a 16-year-old about a very difficult traumatic issue she had experienced, but she was going to have that work from her bedroom, and she was very concerned about how then would her bedroom feel safe after she signed off from that Zoom chat. So, there's some practical tips there around what you can do with her in terms of grounding and trauma-informed work to make sure that she's able to reclaim that space, having brought it into her home when normally she would go somewhere else to get that support service. So although it sounds like there's a lot to think about, and obviously DigiSafe focuses on the risks, we've also tried to show the positives and the amazing opportunities that there are working online. And I think that probably, even when lockdown eases, we'll see a lot of these charities continuing to provide work and support online, because it does offer so many different creative ways to reach more people and to be more accessible to lots of groups of people who maybe have struggled or have got barriers to accessing face-to-face services for whatever reason. So it would be really interesting to see in the months ahead how many services carry on to provide these sorts of supports, and which is, as Jo said, we'll continue to update this guide as we come across new emerging issues.
That's brilliant, Jo. Thank you. That's so useful. I'm going to open up we're going to have a kind of more structured discussion in a wee second, but I just wanted to open up for any questions that people have got, either about the guide or any of the kind of key principles that have been discussed so far. So you can either use the wee emoji to stick your hand up, or you can stick your hand up if you've got your video on. So does anyone want to jump in with a question? Do we have anyone? I've got a question for Joe Robertson. I got it right this time, if that's okay. So Joe, it would be useful, I think, for quite a lot of people in the room, if you can maybe talk a wee bit about how we can make that risk assessment process a little bit less scary and have a bit more structure around it. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So risk assessment is definitely not the most exciting thing. In my experience, I've been through a big risk assessment process on an app for children in care a few years ago, and they can be a lot of work, and it can feel quite overwhelming, especially if you're a small organisation. You know, you're only trying to take one digital service online, and it can feel like, you know, how do I actually do this in a responsible way, so that by the end of the process, I can actually feel confident that I've covered off the main risks. I've done due diligence around those risks. So what we've tried to do is taking a little bit of a sort of design-led approach to the risk assessment process, is just try to lay it out really clearly, what it is you need to do to go through them. Now, it might be that for some charities, you know, something slightly different is going to be needed, but in general, there are, you know, some key steps you've got to do, and it always starts with a bit of research. So we talk here about how to do research, how to use DigiSafe as your first actual point of research in your risk assessment, and then give you a little bit of help with how to assess those risks, including, like Joe said, there's a link to a template for a risk assessment matrix, and there's some suggested headings on there. So you don't need to go online and find a template that will work for you. This one has probably more than you'll need, actually. You might even decide to remove some of these columns because they're not needed for your organisation. But it gives you a template there that you can then feel that I've got everything in one place that I need to be thinking about to make sure this service is as safe as possible. I've got all the information I need here to make a decision about what level of risk my organisation is willing to accept. And actually, DigiSafe advises you shouldn't be making that decision on your own anyway. So, you know, by working through that process of assessing the risk, it helps you to make good decisions. Now, we know about this anyway from doing offline risk assessments, but it can feel like when you're doing it digitally, there's a whole load of new stuff to learn about. But the process here is just laid out so you can go through it. Encourages you to document your decisions, which is really important for accountability, and gives you a suggestion that maybe once you've got to a point where your matrix is fairly static, you know, you've done a lot of your assessment, then at that point you might turn that into something like a little protocol, describing how you're going to use a platform in a particular way, how you're going to do it as safely as possible, because that then helps you to do that process of educating your staff about how to use a platform or how to do it in a way which safeguards users. And then it encourages you obviously to go and review that process, review your matrix, as often as is necessary. And again, if you're a tiny small charity delivering, you know, a very simple digital service, maybe via Messenger or something, you're not going to need to review it as often as a service that is delivering one-to-one work via Zoom, group work via Zoom, maybe as an online community of vulnerable people somewhere as well. So really it's like, you know, that we're trying to give you everything you need here, if you need to go big on it, but also that you know, it'll help you if you need to just, you know, you've not got experience, you need to go through it in a sort of maybe a lighter touch kind of a way.
Yep. Yeah, that's really useful.
That is really key, the risk assessment stuff.
There's also been a link to the blog post, so Charne put that in, that you wrote, Joe, about the youth trip to Dartmoor and around safeguarding, so if people want to read that. Sorry, other Joe, I'm getting confused because now someone's used the Joe with an E and someone's used the Joe without an E.
I mean the Joe with the E, sorry, my bad, Joe.
You're confusing me, this is terrible. What I thought we'd do very quickly is if we can all open up the chat box, so if it'll either say chat or it'll be the little speech bubble icon depending on what device you're using at the moment. And I'd like you all to type in what is the digital safeguarding issue that's the biggest digital safeguarding issue facing your charity at the moment. So what's been the sticking point? So it could be that your board just don't understand the concepts around this and you're not getting that leadership from that trustee level. It could be that there's something technical that you're unsure about and you're not sure if you're compliant with GDPR legislation. It could be that you want to deploy a service onto a digital platform and you're not sure how safe that platform is. So what's the one thing that's the sticking point in your charity at the moment? Put them all in chat. When I give the nod, I'm going to get you to all press enter at the same time. I only do this because John in SCVO loves doing this, and now I've started doing it as well. And then I can't actually keep up with it because all the answers just flood in, but he seems to like it, so I'm just going to do it as well. Okay, right, I'm going to count down 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. I also said the other day that I'd stopped doing countdowns, but now I'm doing it again. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So press return. There we go. Oh, look at that. Isn't that lovely? Okay. Okay, quite a lot in there on training, so both in terms of staff, but also in terms of the board not fully understanding. Safety of the platform itself, which I think can be a difficult one when, you know, the terms and conditions for most of the major platforms are into the hundreds of pages, and actually assessing that on your own can be quite tricky. Delivering focus groups for people with learning disabilities. Both Joes, Charne and Cordy, is there anything in there that kind of stands out for you?
There's one for me from Beth and Harvey.
Okay.
I'll read it. Transitioning to digital with programs and work so rapidly due to COVID that there hasn't been the time to get everyone confident with digital safeguarding. Yeah, I know of commissioners who have been commissioning counselling services from charities, you know, NHS commissioners who have, you know, really made a decision or supported them with the decision of getting a service online quickly to support young people who may be vulnerable due to lockdown sort of measures, versus doing, you know, a three month kind of safeguarding assessment process. So we know that, I think my words would be corners have been cut in places, but that doesn't mean we can't go back and do that. And it's just, there's going to have to be a process around that, I think. DigiSafe should help you do that. Because, you know, if you've got a risk assessment, it'll show that the gaps, the things you maybe not thought about, and it'll help you feel confident in actually what you have already done, because the chances are that you have done some considerations and that your staff have started to learn a little bit. So doing a risk assessment will help you identify what you're already doing to mitigate some of those risks, which I think is really important, to know that what you're getting right, as well as what needs to be done to maybe tighten up a few things.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Joe. That's really useful. Joe, Sharpen or Cordy, there's one in there that I'd particularly like either of you to kind of pick up on, because I think it's one that keeps coming up time and time again from charities, is that difficult thing between providing anonymity to the end user or allowing the person to give, or asking the person for the personal details, so that when you come on to that chat with them again, say a third or fourth counselling session, you can go back and look at notes. And it's that, I guess, that balance between those two. And I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that. So it was a question that came in from Jade specifically. So protecting users' identity with their info stored in our platform specifically, we need to be able to query the database, which means we can't encrypt all the fields. So yeah, just any thoughts on that point?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one. I think we'd always come from firstly the viewpoint of the user needs to decide their level of anonymity and what they feel safe with. And it might be that after a couple of sessions they relax that and feel more confident to be able to share. But there's definitely that tension with needing to be able to query things in the database, or for instance, if someone is completely anonymous and you're very concerned about that they might be at immediate risk, it's hard for the practitioner then to hold that risk remotely and not be able to actually identify that person and where they are, because we know that it's not always possible to track IP addresses even if you're provided with them, and ethically not everyone signs up to that standard anyway. So Childline, for instance, don't track people by IP addresses, whereas other organisations do. So I think initially you have to have that conversation in your teams around when you would break that confidentiality if you can. And I think going back to what Cordy was saying around making sure that the opt-in consent is really clear, especially for vulnerable users and children. So GDPR Article 8 is clearly telling us that children over 13 in the UK can consent to having their data stored online. And there can be exemptions if you're providing counselling as well. So it's good to read up on that. But it's such a I don't know, Cordy, if you want to add anything. It's a real difficult area, this one.
Yeah, I think you've kind of, yeah, I think you've really said it all, Jo. It's really tricky. It's about, as an organisation, working out where you stand on it, and applying your moral framework that you normally use in face-to-face encounters into the online space, and basically making a decision as a team so that it's not one person who's holding all that risk and then having to deal with, somebody else made a point about difficulty supporting staff holding risk online, and I think that's a massive issue. And I think that's why we wanted to acknowledge at the end of the resource that, you know, people need to be dealing with the vicarious trauma that might be happening when people are working from their own home spaces, and that's something that managers really need to think about when moving work away from an office space where you can speak with your colleagues and you can debrief.
Yeah, and it feels to me, because trustees came up, I think Melody had mentioned that it's not so much that the trustee needs to get involved in the minutiae of what will or won't be stored in a database and what that'll look like, but what they do need to get involved in is, you know, how much risk are we willing to take as an organisation, and what impact does that have on a member of staff? Like Jo's point that, you know, if a member of staff feels someone's vulnerable and at risk, and you have a policy of never asking for personal details, and now you have no way of supporting that person, where does that leave that member of staff or that volunteer? So for me, I think the board needs to take some leadership on these types of bigger questions that are not about the technicalities of the platform that you choose.
And a lot of that work you can still do online. I mean, speaking as a clinical supervisor, anyone doing this sort of work should be getting clinical supervision, and that can work just as well online, even if it is a quick debrief or a full-on support call. But I would say, especially when you're doing this work remotely, clinical supervision needs to be built into every funding bid and every piece of work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Maddie or Siobhan, is there anything that you've seen in there that...
No, but I think Jo Robertson had a point.
Cool.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, that's just really good hearing Jo and Cordy talking just now, and it just reminded me that in the end, you know, when your trustees are involved or your senior management is making a decision, all you can do as an organisation sometimes is make a decision on what risk you're willing to accept. You'll never eliminate risk altogether. This is, you know, really helpful to say again, I think, when we're worrying about this kind of stuff, is at some point you have to accept a certain level of risk. And if you've got a good risk assessment, it'll help you feel more confident in doing that, because what a risk assessment pushes you to do is it pushes you to actually articulate what is the thing that you're worried might go wrong. So for example, if you're thinking about protecting your users' identities when they're stored on your platform, what is it that you're concerned about will go wrong? If you're trying to decide what platform to use, accessibility versus safety in people's homes, what is it you're concerned about that will go wrong? If you go track it right back to what is the event here that we think could be not a good thing for our user or possibly for our staff, and then work from there, it helps you identify what you can do to mitigate and what level of risk you're willing to accept. And that kind of purely sort of technical kind of risk assessment sort of levelly process, that is really important, because someone has to make that decision. And if you've done a reasonable amount to do that of risk mitigation, then actually great. Maybe you carry on and you're taking some risks, but you're able to deliver something that's accessible, good for your users, and stores their information as securely as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's a really good point, is that all the services that you're delivering face-to-face in the real world, in inverted commas, are going to have some form of risk assessment, and there is some form of risk. So as soon as you put a counsellor one-to-one in a room with a young person and there's no external scrutiny, there's a massive element of risk there. Arguably, some of the services you're going to be delivering online may have less risk than the ones that you're delivering face-to-face. So I think when you're trying to articulate this stuff to other staff members who've got concerns, and sometimes rightly so, is trying to get them to understand that there's risk across the board, whatever way you deliver things. It's just different types of risk. Okay.
Can I pick up on a question from Rebecca?
Yeah, go for it.
It's the last one there around protecting and supporting young people when they share personally emotional, difficult stories in a group setting when we can't be there in person. Firstly, I'm quite reassured, because most of these questions I think we've attempted to cover in DigiSafe, hopefully, but this one, you know, I'm particularly interested in as well, and I think it is really difficult, I guess, not knowing what your service is or what they'll be talking about. ideally you would be there in person, and in terms of a principle of best practice, it would be that they shouldn't be there unfacilitated, and you should always have 2 facilitators. So if somebody does say something that is triggering or upsetting, you can take one of them out to, say, for instance, a breakout room on Zoom, like you might do in face-to-face settings. You might take someone out who's distressed into a separate room to talk to them confidentially, and then also the other facilitator can make sure the rest of the group are okay after what they've heard. If for some reason you can't have that facilitated session, it's really important to set up group agreements with those young people initially, so they know what to expect, and to think more carefully about what they're willing to share online. Because of that online disinhibition effect that Cordy mentioned, you often do find that people disclose very quickly online, especially if it's anonymous. But even when you can see each other, it's still quite shocking in some ways how quickly things will progress and be discussed. And so it's important that they recognise that, and they don't share things that they then will regret sharing, and giving them some coping strategies and kind of grounding tools for how they're going to practice some self-care if difficult things do come up, and that there's always a member of staff available afterwards if they need that debrief session.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Yeah, and there's a lot of organisations been hesitant to deliver group services online, but it is possible. The link that I gave to the big Google Doc has got some examples of that, particularly in the youth work sector. So people like LGBT Youth Scotland have been delivering online youth work for a number of years, and particularly group work. So there's some really good examples in there of what that looks like. Okay, and what I thought I'd do just with the kind of last wee bit of time that we've got left, it'd be good if everyone can now take the time to put in something that they're particularly proud of in their organisation in terms of delivering services that may be considered risky online, or a change that you've made to your digital safeguarding. So one of those 2 things, so either a change to your digital safeguarding that you've made during COVID, or a transition to delivering a service online that's had an element of risk in your organisation. And again, just using the chat box, put it in, and then in a wee second we'll all hit enter and we'll see some of the examples that are coming through there. While we're waiting, I'm also going to shamelessly plug the next session we've got. So while you're typing that away, the next one next week is on accessibility and UX. We've got the head of UX at the BBC is going to be speaking about that crossover between accessibility and user experience. So that's going to be a really interesting session that we've got coming up next week. So you can click that link and you can book a free place if you're interested in that. Right, hopefully you've all typed in something. So if you all want to share your examples of a service you're now delivering online, or a change that you've made to your online safeguarding, and hit return, and we'll see what you come up with. Wow, some really interesting ones in there. Okay, superb. Okay. Okay. Cordy or Charné, any interesting ones in there that you've spotted?
Really interested by Vicki delivering domestic abuse group work online.
Yeah, Vicki, can you jump in and tell us a bit about that? Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, we do the Freedom Programme and another group for women who've experienced domestic abuse. We did it face to face, but we moved halfway through a term. So we initially started out with people who knew us well, who knew the material, and we started out with a test group of very tech savvy women for our very first one, and we kind of went through it together in terms of learning what we needed to do. So we're now into our second term using Zoom. We've tweaked things here and there. I'm pleased to see that a lot of this stuff we're doing, 2 facilitators, taking people into breakout rooms if someone's getting upset, the grounding stuff, all of that. And from the start, we looked at how, in a lot of ways, there are fewer risks than meeting face to face, particularly from ex-partners and things like that. So it's worked really, really well. We're going to do it forever.
Amazing. Are you able to tell us which charity you work with, Vicki? Is that okay?
It's Sage Scotland,
Right, okay.
Which is a Fife-based domestic abuse charity.
Right.
We do some work in schools, which we've had to put in the back burner, but it's given us the bandwidth to do this project.
That's superb. Yeah, and do you feel that leadership has come from your trustees and board as well in terms of that transition to moving online?
It took it took a little bit of persuading to move to online, and doing the first session and proving that it worked with our existing group was massive. And just documenting what we were doing and sharing that and getting lots, I mean, I have to say you guys have been instrumental in helping us get that set up. Not just saying that, but it's been really helpful to have that at our backs. Even just to share some of the documents that have come out some of these calls with our board, and it made them all feel a bit more comfortable about the whole thing, because a lot of the board were a wee bit scared of the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. You shouldn't say that in a call, Vicky, because Siobhan will immediately email you and ask you to write a blog about it afterwards. So.
Well, actually, sorry, Vicky, I was actually just about to say the Catalyst are doing what's called service recipes, and they are looking for anybody. So this is kind of anybody on the call. I think there's a few of you, or if not all of you, have said at least you've done something, and they're looking for really good examples of how things have shifted online and different ways that people have done things. So they would definitely like to hear from you, Vicky. So I'm just going to put them in the chat box as a place for you to look.
Siobhan's already got her claws into me, actually.
Oh shit, that's fine, that's fine, because it will work. It will work both ways. Because if Siobhan does it, then it'll go to the Catalyst, so that's fine.
I was just about to jump in to say Siobhan and Vicky are already talking case study.
Excellent.
One of the things I do remember Vicky saying, but it was many weeks ago and you've moved on so much since then, was that Vicky found the blog that Alison, who's also on the call, wrote about Zoom calling and privacy quite useful. And those blogs...
Oh yes, hello.
Yes. Do you want to talk about it, Vicky? Is it too long ago?
Yeah, well, I've ripped off a load of your stuff, Alison, and passed it off as my own. No, I've stuck it into our policies and our project documents, and referred my colleagues to it. So yeah, thank you for that.
Oh, that's wonderful. I have a legacy at long last. How good is that?
So one of the things I remember Vicky saying many weeks ago was just the fact that those documents are there to signpost trustees to signpost senior management to. So that's the same with this DigiSafe guide as well. It's there for you to use, not just to design your own services, but also to signpost other people to. So if you are getting any flack that there's risk in the online delivery you're doing, as everyone said, there's risk in offline face-to-face delivery as well. So you can also use all this documentation to signpost other people to, as well as using yourselves. And that can reassure them, which is how Vicky used that Zoom blog, which I'll just pop in the chat as well. Was there any other questions our speakers wanted to pick up on? Thank you, Vicky.
Yeah, that was really useful, Vicky. Thank you.
Yes.
So I don't have a question particular, but thank you for sharing that, Vicky. I think that's something that we've heard echoed from so many of the charities that we work with, who just felt a lot of kind of fear for moving things online. And I think often we can get ourselves into knots and just get to the stage where we just feel paralyzed by that fear. But really, if we keep it focused on the people that we're trying to serve and the people that we're trying to support, like Joe said earlier, there's always going to be a bit of a trade-off. There's always some level of risk involved. So you can either make things super secure, but it's not at all accessible to anybody, or you can open things up and learn as you go, and put some measures in place that will protect you, and that does help you to start to think about the more long-term risks. But also technology changes every week. I saw some of the comments and questions from people about kind of updated Zoom policies and things like that. I mean, that changes on the daily. It's so hard to kind of keep on track with these things. And just as technology changes, I think our policies need to be really reflective of the changing world that we live in. So it's something that we're not just going to rest on our laurels and kind of expect that we've got a great safeguarding policy and that's going to keep us going for the next 3 years. We're going to have to adapt it and keep reviewing it as we go. And people often talk about, I think, future-proofing things. I think it's a great thing to think about, but as COVID has taught us, it's really hard to plan for the future. We never know what's going to happen. And so just being prepared for those kind of unexpected eventualities that may occur, and being prepared to change as we go. I think we always talk at CAST about kind of learning as you go, test and learn, test and learn. That's all we can really do. We're all learning in this process, and we're all learning from the current context. You know, none of us could have predicted this. I certainly wish I could, but but I don't have that kind of power. But I think we've all learned so much in this process, and it's maybe forced us to let go of some of those fears and push the boundaries a bit more. And I think generally it's something that we can look back on, hopefully, and say that we've come out stronger and we've learned so much through the process.
Yeah, thanks for that, Charne. Just a really important point from Bex there, which was literally lol future-proofing, which pretty much sums it up. The future-proofing thing, I mean, personally, I think it's not just like, oh, you know, we can't future-proof. It's bordering on dangerous, where you're, and again, going back to trustees and your senior leaders, think that they can do something that's fixed in time and the world will just stay the same because we built a platform. And it's so utterly ridiculous, but people talk about it time and time again. So it needs to be challenged, I think, at all levels in your organisation. It is definitely lol. I think that's a good assessment from Bex there. Okay, any other speakers, any kind of finishing notes or points in terms of people taking that next step on their journey? And I think Joe's point particularly about when we're talking about this, we're talking about either a new service that you're delivering online or changing a service that exists already, or actually you might be retrofitting some of this safeguarding into something you're already deploying online. I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on that from Cordy, Charne, or two Joes.
Yeah, I'd chip in with a little counter to the, not exactly counter to future-proofing, but there's a lot of stuff that you could keep up with, but realizing that you'll never keep up with everything that's changing across all the platforms that you're using. And so there's something about what does good enough look like in terms of keeping up to date with changes to the digital world. Realistically, you can't review your policies every month. Maybe even 3 months is actually, that's quite a lot. So I think there's something about deciding what is often enough. What level of policy review is acceptable to our organisation, given our attempts to try and deliver services and also keep up to date with stuff. Because you could spend your whole time keeping up to date and you'd never deliver anything, I reckon.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Any other thoughts from other speakers? Okay, putting you on the spot there.
I have, sorry Ross, just on saying that, there was I think something that Mike Whitehead said, who I think has actually unfortunately had to leave, he had to go to another meeting, about the fear that they're missing something because they've moved things online. There's like this fear around, have we missed something? What are we missing? And that for me goes back to Joe's point around there is only so much you can do. Think about it logically, which I think all of our speakers have said, is that idea that you're probably not missing anything. It's about keeping it up to date. It's about going back and reflecting, doing your retrospectives, carrying out that idea of where are we at, what are we doing, where are we going next. And Mike is not alone in thinking that. The work that Ross and I have done with our senior leaders, lots of chief execs and CEOs and managers, there is that idea of, oh, God, we've done this now. Where do we go next? What do we do? What are we missing? It's like, it's okay, you're not missing anything. It's fine. Just take a breath.
If I can add to that, I would just say always ask your service users as well, because they're the best judge in what feels safe. And we always need to be led by experts by experience, especially those who've experienced abuse and trauma, because they'll be ultra switched on to what feels safe and what feels risky. So I would always go back to them and ask whether it felt comfortable and safe, what would make it feel better to engage with in the future. And they're your best judge, really, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice, Joe, actually. Yeah, so there's the SCVO digital pages have got a really good section on service design, which covers some of the basics of thinking about how you involve your users. Peter Jacobs, who came on one of the calls talking about Bernardo's switch to using WhatsApp for some of the frontline services. That came out of sessions they ran with young people, and overwhelmingly young people were telling them the platform we want to communicate with you is WhatsApp, because it's the one we know how it works. It's on our device. We don't have to go on your website. We don't have to download some weird app that you've paid loads of money to set up. So here's the space we're comfortable, but that acceptance in Bernardo's that this is going to come with a lot of risk, but the risk of not doing it and not supporting those young people is much bigger than the risk of being on that platform. So there's risk with everything, but it's an act of balancing up where is that risk going to sit and what are you willing to take. The final plug as well, just Alison's guides on cybersecurity are really good. So Alison Stone, who's on the call, if you Google SCVO cybersecurity, you'll get it. There's also some links there to some external sources, like things like National Cybersecurity Centre's guides. So when you were talking about not just safeguarding of people, but also some of the more technical elements of it, there's some really useful stuff in there. Right, I am going to finish up. We will have a podcast in this call. Bex, who's on the call, will be relieved to know that Maddie and I are going to do some recording after this. So there will be some actual podcasts come out. We've been slackers in that, I'm very sorry. We'll also have the video up on the SCVO YouTube page. So if you think this is going to be useful to other people, you can share that with people and you can send it on to people. Siobhan, Maddie, anything else that you want to add before we finish up?
Sorry, yes, I was quickly Googling something. I was just having a brief kind of WhatsApp with Lauren Pluce, who we can't see because she was having a lunch, about Young Scots 5 rights that they developed a few years ago, and how that could fit into a lot of what's being talked about here as well, around actually from that point of view about helping, you know, kind of young people understand what some of these terms mean and what they do as well. So that was kind of a bit of a plug for that. I'm sure Lauren could tell you more, but she's probably got a mouthful of vegan risotto right now.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. No, actually, if you Google that, you'll find it on the Young Scot site. I think it might even have its own standalone website, but that's a really useful resource. Siobhan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just got my speaker right. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the Never More Needed campaign, which is a UK-wide campaign, which SCVO was part of. And I think from this call especially, that's really important. So Never More Needed is about you showcasing your charities and the work that you do, and telling the story of your impact. And I think telling the story of your safeguarding impact would be of huge value to other charities, because we are seeing time and time again that charities are really struggling with this subject. DigiSafe guide's obviously going to really help with that. So if any of you use the guides and apply it to your own services, it would be fabulous if you could share that story. Obviously tag We Are the Catalysts and the DigiSafe, but also hashtag Never More Needed, and that'll be picked up by the campaign. They want to use these stories to influence funders and governments and the general public, really, to remind them how important the third sector and the charity sector is, especially at this time. And also our news team, Third Force News, would like to write features just in the same way as we've talked about the recipes and the case studies. They're interested in writing feature stories. So I'll pop a link to the Never More Needed campaign and our Third Force News site. They can also advertise your own events. So they send out a weekly bulletin across Scotland. So I'll pop the link for that in. So if you have any events coming up, you can pop your event on and they will send that out right across all third sector in Scotland. And back to Ross.
Brilliant, thanks Siobhan. Yeah, so final thing, if you go on the SCVO events page, you'll get the one for next week. So I said accessibility and UX, we're going to be talking about next Tuesday. There's also the Curve training session. So we've got a free 90-minute training session. So they're supported by the Catalyst, SCVO, the Health and Social Care Alliance, and also the R.S. McDonald Charitable Trust. So there's one tomorrow. Yes, one tomorrow, which I'm running. Jen's looking at me going, you better remember there's one tomorrow. So
don't do that to me.
Right, so there's one I'm running tomorrow on digital strategy, and we've got a whole range of other ones coming up. We've got, so Maddie ran one yesterday, for example, on using tools like Teams and Slack and internal comms. We had one recently on Power BI and building data dashboards. So we've got loads of really practical sessions coming up, and they're all free if you work for a third sector organisation. Right, I'm going to shut up. Thank you very much to our speakers. So Joe Robertson, Joe Sharpen, Cordy Ruck, And also, well, my screens have all gone about. Where's my fourth speaker gone?